kāpēc vēlēšanas ir tāds unikāls process un nevienmēr tehniskie rīki varbūt sasniegs to mērķi. Kaut vai mēs paņemam Latvijas Republikas konstitūciju, kur ir nostiprināti šie vispārīgie vēlēšanu principi, demokrātisku vēlēšanu principi, tad šeit jūs tos redzat. Un tas galvenā doma, kas vēlēšanās ir ļoti svarīga, ka katrai balsošanas metodei, jaunai vai jau senāk lietotāji, ir jāatbilst visiem šiem demokrātisko vēlēšanu pamatiem, pēc iespējas jācenšas sasniegt šīs, lai nebūtu pretrunā ar šiem principiem. Un, protams, ja mēs runājam par internetu vēlēšanām, tad šis lielākais trūkums, kā tehniski nav iespējams nodrošināt interneta vidē pilnīgu šo vēlēšanu aizklātumu. Tātad šis ir tas pats galvenais princips, ko, piemēram, ja mēs domātu par vēlēšanām interneta vidē, tad mums būtu kā sabiedrībā jāvienojas, vai tad šis 100 gadus senais vēlēšana demokrātijas princips būtu, tātad vai mēs esam gatavi, ka mēs pieņemam, ka vēlēšanu vidē šis princips vairs nav tik būtisks, ja vēlētājs zina, ka balsojot internetā, viņa balsojums nav pilnīgi aizklāts un ir šī papildus iespēja iecirknī nobalsot, ja tomēr kāds apdraud šo aizklātumu. Bet tas ir pieņemami un tā mēs tagad turpmāk, tad mums varētu būt šāds izņēmums. Tas, ko jau arī pieminēja Jaundaldera kungs, vēlēšanas, protams, nav tikai pakalpojums, un, diemžēl, varbūt mūsdienās, jo biežāk mēs lietojam ikdienas dzīvē šos interneta vidi un interneta rīkus, tad sastopamies arī ar vēlētājiem sabiedrību to neizpratni. Kāpēc, piemēram, mēs varam internetā nopirkt lietas, tik vienkārši nērti vai pārskaitījums veikt bankā, bet nevaram nobalsot internetā. Un šeit arī mēs noteikti saskārtos ar tādu, ja mēs ieviestu internetu balsošanu, tāpat tas nebūtu tik vienkārši, jo mēs nevarētu izmantot internetu bankas autentifikāciju. Balsošanā internetā mums vajadzētu noteikti vismaz elektronisko parakstu, drošu elektronisko parakstu. Un tieši kad balsošana tad ir valsts pasākums. Un tad visiem šiem tehniskiem rīkiem būtu jāatbilst arī šiem vēlēšanu principiem. Un tad, protams, šis temats jau tiešām vismaz 10 gadu vecs, vai pat vēl senāks, ir bijušas darba grupas un apspriedes, kā attīstīt šo jomu, bet vienmēr kaut kā tomēr visdrīzāk vairākums sabiedrības, vismaz arī šobrīd šķiet šī tendence nav gatava Latvijā ieviest internetu balsošanu, tad diskusijā varētu arī būt tādi jautājumi, vai kādreiz vispār varētu būt šāds laiks, kad mēs to varētu ieviest, un kā ar mums pašiem, vai mēs esam gatavi, pirmkārt tiešām atteikties no kaut kādiem šiem principiem vēlēšanu, iespējams interneta vidē, vai mēs vispār saprotam kā vēlētāji, vai mēs spētu izkontrolēt šo internetu vidi, vai mums ir pietiekami zināšanas, vai mēs, kā centrālā vēlēšana komisija, vai mums pietiekami resursi šo visu kvalitatīvi ieviest. Un šie ir tie jautājumi, par ko būtu jādomā ieviešot internetā diskusiju. Saprotu, ka laikam 5 minūtes būs pagājušas. Jā. Vai man ir vēl laiks? Tas, kas ierunājās fonā, tas bija brīdinājums, pareizi? Tas ir minūtes brīdinājums. Jā,
Unfortunately, we are extremely short on time, and thank you, Kristīne, for your presentation. Just for the sake of moving forward, and we really do want to get to questions and answers part of this event. We all have heard in the main event and obviously elsewhere that some country nearby has some experience in this field we are discussing here today. And I'm happy to see Ms. Liisa Paast from Cybernetica from Estonia on our event today. So Liisa, please tell us, what are you doing to secure iVoting in Estonia? And I see you already on presentation, also the floor is yours.
And now I'm even unmuted. Thank you for that introduction. And in addition to being now a
Sveiki visiem! Ja kādam ir problēmas ar pievienošanos, rakstiet, jo ir apakšā labajā stūrītī ir breakout rooms. Jums ir jābūt iespējai pievienoties istabā, kurā jūs vēlaties. Ja jums gadījumā nesanāk, tad vai nav jūsu vēlamā istaba, tad droši rakstiet, mēs mēģināsim jums palīdzēt sarunā.
That no system is 100% secure 100% time. And if anyone tells you that your elections are unhackable, they're either insane, criminal, or criminally insane. All technologies in themselves contain risks, whether they're digital or analog. And it's not like election meddling started with the technology, with digital technology. But those of us who grew up in the Soviet Union well remember how rigged those elections were, regardless of not relying on digital technology at any point. So election meddling in the end is a political and not a technical issue. Technology is just a field. And as far as I understood from the previous speaker, it really comes not to the technology, but to the constitutional requirements. The Estonian constitution outlines that elections are to be general, uniform, direct, and based on secret voting. And therefore, in technology, whether it's in internet voting, whether it's election information systems, tallying, candidate registration, you have to introduce technology in a way that you manage risks and make sure that your technology meets those requirements, as in the end, that's a fundamental question of the legitimacy of democracy and governance. And that also means that your elections, it is my belief, having risk managed Estonian elections, should not be any more digital than the governance they support. In other words, elections are not where you across the board introduce unique digital reliance unless you are pretty digital governance and society already. And this is what the Estonian internet voting system, now going specifically into internet voting, looks like on a system level. And credit to this illustration goes to my colleague Jan Willemsson, the cryptographer behind a lot of our internet voting. But to simplify things, this is what it looks like in terms of the trip or the journey of the vote. The Estonian internet voting system mimics the double envelope postal voting system that's used across the world. But instead of the postal system, digital technologies used. It does essentially rely on the Estonian government-backed secure digital identity, the ID card's digital element, that is used both to authenticate the user, parallel to presenting your ID at the polling station. At the polling station, it's two-factor in that it's you and something that you have the ID. In this, it's you, it's something that you know. So your PIN code and something that you have the ID card or the cell phone with a crypto SIM card. After authentication, then the digital signature essentially is used to form the outer envelope, the envelope that anonymizes the vote, before it then is deposited in the collecting server.
1 minute.
And the ID isn't essential just in terms of the security and identity it provides, but also in that it facilitates a wider ecosystem that builds habit of using digital services. And Estonia, since you can't in remote digital voting in this sense, control for the environment, the secrecy of the polling booth, Estonia has allowed to cast multiple votes online where only the latest vote counts, which means that you disincentivize vote buying, you disincentivize coercion of any sort. And there's been no widespread evidence in Estonia of either of those happening, which then means that in the end, it's about good technology development. It's about security procedures, logging, network segmentation, all of that. But it's also about thinking of, first and foremost, about how you meet the constitutional requirements, and in particular, how far you can universally verify a vote or the vote counting, and how far can an individual talk about their individual verifiability of the vote, since of course, as will be highlighted today, privacy and secrecy are balanced with verifiability. You cannot have both in an overlapping way. So it's a social agreement of where you place that. And with that, I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Lisa. Moving forward, obviously elections, it's actually about human rights, and I'm delighted to see in this discussion here today, Mr. Juris Jansons, Ombudsman of the Republic of Latvia. And I'm starting to feeling that with each next speaker, the complexity of explaining the problem in 5 minutes will increase, but we'll need to still try to stick to 5 minutes. Jansona kungs, lūdzu, skatu ir jūsu.
Yeah, sveicināt. Hello, everyone. My presentation will be in Latvian, but my thesis actually are available also in English. So, tā, uzliksim. Kā tagad bija tas jāuzliek? Screenshot. Just a second. So, es nevaru... Jā, nu, diemžēl es nevaru atrast savus tos slaidus tagad uzlikt, varbūt, bet, nu, vienmēr sakot, jebkuru demokrātijas tiesisko režīmu raksturo 3 lietas. Likuma virsvadības princips, pilsoniskās sabiedrības institūta un brīvas un taisnīgas vēlēšanas. Vēlēšanas un tautas nobalsošana ir demokrātijas institūti, kas nav zaudējuši savu aktualitāti, efektivitāti un leģitimitāti. Tādēļ loģiski izriet jautājums, ja valsts pakāpeniski pāriet uz e-pārvaldi vai tehniskā modernizācija skars vēlēšanu procesu un tautas nobalsošanu. Vērtēt internetu vēlēšanu konstitucionalitāti e-demokrātijas ietvaros var ievērot konstitucionālu tiesisko atbilstību vienlīdz attiecībā uz vēlēšanu pamatprincipiem, tā arī galvenajām tiesiskām prasībām, kas izriet no internetu vēlēšanu modeļa īpatnībām. Ir vairākas valsts, kuras ir vērtējušas e-vēlēšanu konstitucionalitāti, un šī brīža atziņa ir. Šādas vēlēšanas pašas par sevi nav antikonstitucionālas, ar atrunu, kādā kontekstā mēs tās aplūkojam. Konstitucionālās un augstākās tiesas ir uzsvēruši, ka Eiropas cilvēktiesību un pamatbrīvību aizsardzības konvencijas pirmā protokola 3. pants, kas garantē pilsoņiem tiesības vēlēt, ir attiecināms tikai uz valsts institūtiem ar leģislatīvo funkciju. Ieviešot internetu vēlēšanas, jāpatur prātā, ka vēlētājiem nepieciešama noteikti tehniska pieredze, kuru nevar uzskatīt par pašsaprotam lielākai daļai vēlētāju. Mans priekšlikums ir šis sarunas rezultātā likt uz iedomātiem temīdu svaru kausiem par un pret argumentus internetu vēlēšanu ieviešanai. Ko dos šī argumenta līdzsvarošana? Atbild uz jautājumu, esam gatavi nekavējoties pāriet uz internetu vēlēšanām, vai un kāda priekšdarba būtu jāveic, lai valstī ieviestu internetu vēlēšanas. Internetu vēlēšanas ieviešanas motīvi ir dažādi, un visbiežāk piesaukti iemesli ir, ka e-vēlēšanas palielināt vēlētāju mobilitāti, dot iespēju piedalīties vēlēšanās vēlētājiem, kur dzīvo ārpus savas mītnes valsts, palielināt vēlētāju aktivitāti, paplašināt slimnieku un personu ar īpašām vajadzībām piekļuvu vēlēšanu procesam, samazināt vēlēšanu izmaksas, ļaut publicēt vēlēšanu rezultātus daudz operatīvāk. Šie argumenti tiek likti uz vienu svaru kausu, uz otru svaru kausu varētu gulties tādi pretargumenti kā šķērslis jebkurā e-balsošanas sistēmā visā pasaulē ir drošības jautājums. Nodotu balsu var mainīt, ja sistēma to pieļauj, vai ar sistēmas izveidi ir saistīta persona, kur ļaunprātīgi izmanto sistēmas trūkumus. Vēlētāju vietā var balsot neautorizēts vēlētājs. E-vēlēšanas modelis negarantē aizklātumu un privātumu ievērošanu. Man kā tiesības sargam līdzās tehniskajiem riskiem lielākās bažas rada privātumu un aizklātumu garantēšana internetu vēlēšanās. Privātumu, personas datu aizsardzību un aizklātumu garantijas varētu būt lielāka izaicinājuma internetu vēlēšanās. Nav jāpieņem, ka cilvēki intereses sargāt privātumu ir tikai viņu pašu interesēs. Aizklātā balsošana liek domāt, ka rūpes par citu interesēm un jūtām ir pietiekams pamatojums prasībai ievērot konfidencialitāti, anonimitāti un pat slepenību daudzos apstākļos. Demokrātiskai iekārtai ir jāsargā individa privātums, jo, ja pilsoņiem tiek piešķirtas tiesības pieņemt lēmumus par citiem, ņemot vērā viņu līdzdalību politiskajā procesā, secīgi viņiem jābūt tiesībām pieņemt lēmumus pašiem par sevi vissvarīgākajās personīgajās lietās. Ja privātums ir vērtība demokrātijā, tad šai vērtībai jābūt pakārtotai un iespējams raksturotai tādā veidā, kas sargā individa patību, konfidencialitāti un intimitāti. Balsošanas aizklātums ir standarta pamatojums šai koncepcijai. Privātums vēlēšanu kabīnē rada drošības sajūtu, ka mēs esam brīvi savā izvēlē un nebūsim pakļauti ārējam spiedienam vai ietekmēšanai. Balsošanas aizklātuma pamatojums ir tas, ka tas nepieciešams, lai novērstu to, ka korupcija, piespiešana, iebiedēšana grauj vēlēšanu procesu godīgu. Aizklātums balsošanā neliedz personām paust savu izvēli, un juridiski neviens nevar pieprasīt, lai personas atklāja savas izvēles balsojumā. Tomēr atklāts jautājums ir, kā internetu vēlēšanas var garantēt aizklātumu. Ja balsošanas aizklātums netiek ievērots un sistēma pieļauj nesankcionētu personas datu apstrādi, tas var veidot būtisku privātumu aizskārumu, kas demokrātiskā valstī nav pieļaujams. Manā ieskatā svaru kausos liktā atvieglotā procedūra, ātrums, ērtums nevar būt svarīgāk un kompensēt būtiskus privātuma apdraudējumus, kā arī konfidencialitātes ievērošanas nepieciešamību. Un visbeidzot, publiskajā telpā diskusijas par pārēju uz internetu vēlēšanām izskan biežāk, un tam iemesls nav tikai paudžu nomaiņa. Modernās tehnoloģijas intensīvāk ienāk mūsu ikdienā, tādēļ loģiski secināt, ka šis process skars arī vēlēšanas. Internetu vēlēšanas jau šobrīd ir realitāte dažās valstīs, tādēļ nav izslēgts, ka arī Latvijā nākotnē pie pilnīgas digitālās drošības garantiem un vēlēšanu pamatprincipu ievērošanas šādā vēlēšana modelī varētu pāriet uz internetu vēlēšanām. Paldies.
Paldies, Jansson kungs. And finally, wrapping up initial pitch session, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Andris Ambainis from the University of Latvia. I hope you already have heard him during core event, but please, Mr. Ambainis, tell us what is it so wrong about integrity or security? We can't hear you, Andris.
Yeah, so thanks for the introduction and for inviting me to this discussion. So here are briefly my points about internet voting. Well, I'm a computer scientist. I'm not a security expert, but I believe in looking at the leading computer security experts and what they say. And I think the opinion is close to anonymous. So, yeah, if we have internet banking, why not elections? Matt Blaze from Georgetown University, one of the world's leading computer security experts. The short answer is that bank transactions are much simpler problems than voting. They are reversible, non-anonymous, and have trusted parties to provide indemnification. That is, compensation for loss. And fraud happens quite regularly. The costs are built into transaction fees. None of that is true for voting. Voting has to be anonymous, and there is no mechanism of compensation for voting fraud whatsoever. Yeah, so what makes internet voting difficult? One thing is that it's a protocol that involves 1 million voters in case of Latvia. And for every of those 1 million people, one would have to provide guarantee that their vote is counted correctly. as opposed to being correctly added to an incorrect total of remaining 999,999 voters. And the really big issue is privacy versus verifiability. If we insist on privacy of the voter, it makes it difficult to verify the result. If we add layers of verification, we might compromise the secrecy of voter. In other words, a mechanism that is designed to assure voter that his vote has been counted correctly could be also used to assure someone else that this voter has voted in the correct way. Another dimension is that voting is a very high stakes event. In an election, a fate of country can be imbalanced. If a vote goes differently, this could change the fate of country for generations. So this is an extremely high stakes event, and a security against state level attackers is required. So the cost of things going wrong is extremely high, and there might be attackers with enormous resources involved. And to summarize, here are some notes from an expert panel of the US National Academy of Sciences. So there is a 200-page volume called Securing the Vote, Protecting American Democracy, with which they came up 2 years ago. They looked at experience of all the countries in the world, including Estonia, and their basic conclusion is that elections should be conducted with human-readable paper ballots. These may be marked by hand or by machine. Recounts and audits should be conducted by human inspection of these ballots. And states should mandate risk-limiting audits to make sure that the processes have not gone wrong. And with current technology, risk-limiting audits requires the use of paper ballots. And regarding internet voting, at the present time, internet should not be used for the return of marked ballots. Further, internet voting should not be used in future until very robust guarantees of security and verifiability are developed and in place, as no known technology guarantees the secrecy, security, and verifiability of a marked ballot transmitted over the internet. This is not opinion of just myself. This is the opinion of US National Academy of Sciences. And if we believe in policy based on science, US National Academy of Science is one of the foremost authorities in the world. Thanks.
Thank you, Andris. You're my hero for today. I even didn't interrupt you with 1 minute warning because I knew you were coming in time. So thank you all co-hosts for these short pitches. I know that you've been given impossible task to explain in 5 minutes what's probably worth of scientific research for a few years. But summing up, and before I actually sum up, I just want to remind to all the attendees, if you have a question, I see some questions popping up on chat, but if you do have a question, please raise your hand in Zoom. There's a button, reactions, below your screen, and there's then button raise hand. Raise your hand to ask a question, then I will ask you to unmute. But summing up, actually, what I think we learned today, that elections are a bit different than anything else that we face every day in our lives. It is indeed much more than just technological controls that are usually deployed in all the systems to secure them, even though there's really no absolutely secure system as such. And there's a trade-off to be achieved, and the question to be asked, which technology should or should not be used in elections process. So the big question is, where do we go from here? So let me check your hands. I do see a hand. And I do see a hand from our Estonian colleague, Mr. Williamson. Hopefully it's gonna work.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, 2 minutes to ask a question as we discussed.
Yeah, it's more like a comment. I wanted to comment on what Andris Ambainis said. We have to take a note that a lot of what he showed wasn't actually specific to electronic voting. So the issue of privacy versus verifiability also occurs in case of paper voting. So for instance, if you have a pile of millions of votes and an independent auditor would like to check them, it's actually impossible to make sure that all the votes come from eligible voters, so that no ballot box stuffing actually happened. And there are, for instance, countries who fight this problem by de-anonymizing the ballots. UK, for instance, that is also considered to be an old democratic country, but they have numbered ballot sheets, for instance, that allow tracing the votes back, for instance, to check their eligibility. So this is one example of verifiability versus anonymity trade-off that you may need to do also in case of your good old paper voting. And another point I wanted to make is that the view that paper voting guarantees anonymity is less and less true in the face of developing technology. You have all sorts of fancy stuff like fingerprinting paper sheets using, let's say, high-resolution camera that will also help you to break anonymity paper votes, for instance. So the benefits of paper voting, while for achieving the sorts of properties that we would like them, is less and less clear for me.
All right, thank you. Andris, maybe you can comment briefly.
Well, I think no system is perfect, but there is a difference in the magnitude of possible attacks and the magnitude of consequences. Digital voting does put an enormous trust in the central vote counting system. In the case of paper voting is inherently distributed, which makes large-scale fraud more difficult. So large-scale fraud typically on paper voting typically happens in undemocratic countries where the voting process is essentially run by the governing party. Well, in Russia, there is nothing what you can do because Putin controls everything. He can stuff the ballots. In democratic countries, large-scale paper voting fraud is extremely uncommon and is extremely difficult. And in contrast, e-voting puts this all centralizes the vote counting and makes large-scale attacks much more plausible.
So if I can add from myself, if I hear you correctly, Andris, it's actually about the cost of compromise as well. If it takes quite a huge effort to compromise a million paper ballots dispersed across the country, then the potential cost of compromise, and we have to be aware that we are talking about risks here, to compromise a million centrally deposited electronic ballots. These are two different scales, what we are talking about. And usually, from my experience, risks, or rather attacks, follow the path of the least resistance. So if it's cheap to attack, I won't seek most elegant and beautiful way. I will do the cheapest, dirtiest, easiest way to attack something I am about to attack. So just a quick note for participants, please do use your name when submitting comments in chat and questions. That will not only allow us to properly address those that we will not be able to answer during this event, but also help me to prioritize questions. And if you have a question also, just reminding, you can always raise your hand digitally in Zoom and you will be given the floor. I actually saw an interesting comment or rather question before we even started from Mr. Juris Borzovs. And I think it's the question probably to your Estonian colleagues. One of your colleagues, it's easy to comment on person not present in any event, right? But there's a rumor that Mr. Helger Lipma, one of the past employees of Cybernetica, I believe, is still voting in paper. Can you comment? I don't know, Lisa or...
I mean, listen, just like I don't comment on people's personal lives, I don't comment on people's choice of convenience of how they choose to vote. However, if we look at the path of least resistance, and I would propose that Dr. Lipma is not the path of least resistance in any system. He's a brilliant cryptographer. Then the path of least resistance is not voting regardless of how you vote. But if you look at the attacks on elections in the past decade, and particularly those that we know or believe to be by state-sponsored actors, and particularly the APTs that are related to the intelligence agencies of Russian Federation, they tend to go after the information space. They tend to delegitimize the whole conversation, because that's much easier to do than to, to compromise the cryptography of whether it's of Dr. Willemson, of whether it's of Dr. Lipma, or whether it's of the previous speaker, also a technology professor. And then the path of least resistance is in the systems around elections, the parties and candidates computer systems, down the supply line, using universal vulnerabilities to get into the voter registration systems, vulnerabilities that have been used similarly for everything else. And even those specifically aimed at elections and election organizers, such as, let's say, Ukraine 2014, are against the publication of results. The content, it's claimed that the content of the results publishing website of the Ukrainian Central Elections Commission was changed. Simple defamation attack in 2014, showing the winner to be someone who actually became 11th, Dmitry Yarosh. So the path of least resistance is not the vote anyway, currently. It's the information space, it's up and down the supply chain, and it's in the political participants, because the attacker is looking to delegitimize all the players in politics and not to change a single vote in the process necessarily.
Sure, and I think it's the main takeaway is that it's never static as well. This path is constantly changing and adapting to the situation as it changes. And the uneasy part, having a look at the chat, which I believe is following separate life already here, just as a proof that this is really kind of interesting topic to discuss. The uneasy part is actually, I think, it's not about security or secrecy at the same time. It's about trade-off between those two and taking into the mix of general risk profile in general. We have another hand raised. Please, Oskars, do say your name and organization you represent, and hopefully it's going to work. You should be able to unmute yourself now.
Yes, hopefully you can hear me. Oskars, I am not actually representing my organization here, Oskars Blumbergs. I'm working for SCB currently, just to give some background. And I am dealing with cybersecurity. And what I actually want to point out that we tend to over evaluate or over stress those technology aspects. But actually what's more important, that's people who are dealing and working with this technology. And I actually tend to share this opinion expressed by Jan that even if we consider paper or those ballots, it's still technology. It's technology from 18th century, 17th or whatever, I don't recall, yeah, when paper was invented. But anyway, it was not my point, I guess. What's very important to consider and why I don't believe that internet voting is a good idea, that basically there should be some barrier for participation. It's like that people have to invest into that. It shouldn't be like emotional shopping or pass by voting. So people have to invest in understanding what's in the political programs, and those persons who are actually ready to do that, they are ready to take this next step and to go to the voting location and to do that. And this is really important aspect to consider, and this is somewhat kind of raising the bar for this populism, which is, I guess, getting more and more important nowadays. And this is something what's not actually what seems to be missing in this discussion pros or against electronic voting. So voting never should be like this emotional shopping.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you, Oskars. I think this is a very fair point. Whether or not lowering the cost of participation in voting, is it a good or not so good thing? But I even would take it further. Is it the only thing that's missing, preventing people from participating in elections? I can be frank with you. I have participated in every election and every voting process where I was able to participate, and I'm quite old. I've been in some. So it has never been a problem to me, but obviously there are people living abroad and there are different audiences that we need to counterbalance. We are extremely short on time, and I see in the chat, if I may take the final question from the person who cannot raise a hand, I will try to find him in the list of participants. Mr. Alberts, you should be able to unmute yourself now and ask a question, but please do stick to 2 minutes.
Thank you, Aigars. So initially, I shall say one comment to our Estonian friends. Thank you for your presentation. Let's remember that 8 years ago, Tarvi Mentens, in his presentation in LATA conference, was much, much more optimistic than you are today. You are much more realistic. Congratulations. 7 years ago, I was in Tallinn when Alex Halderman and Harry Hursti audited your system. I must say that the general security level of your system 7 years ago was very, very, very sad. I hope that today it is much better. What I would like to wish you, I wish you to survive, and I wish you not to hesitate about the professional quality of such people like Ron Rivest and Alex Halderman, what you have done in your publications. And now some words to our internal Latvian kitchen. Profesors Ambainis savā prezentācijā pieminēja to grāmatu Secure Voting, Protecting American Democracy. Es neesmu redzējis nevienu grāmatu un nevienu zinātnes publikāciju ar tik iespaidīgu autoru un jo sevišķi recenzentu sarakstu. Mans padoms būtu mūsu valstī atbildīgākajām personām, Levita un Kariņa kungiem, izdot rīkojumu visiem, kuri runā par potenciālām e-referendumiem, faktiski domājot e-vēlēšanas, būsim atklāti. Izdot rīkojumu šo grāmatu izlasīt un apstiprināt, ka viņi ir sapratuši šī grāmatas saturu. Otra lieta par vienu risku, ko profesors Ambainis savā prezentācijā neminēja. Tā ir galvenā problēma. Jā, tā ir galvenā problēma visiem drošības risinājumiem, kas apkalpo valdības un bankas. Tā ir nedokumentētā, iebūvētā funkcionalitāte aparatūrā. Latvijā par šo problēmu neviens par šīm problēmām faktiski netiek informēts. Mēs reizēm izlasām, ka amerikāņu NSA ar milzu pūlēm ir kādā ķīniešu čipā atklājuši kaut ko. Tas ir viss. Lūk, un šis viens arguments pašreizējās faktiski kiberkara apstākļos, kāds valda pasaulē, ir pietiekams, lai latvieši izmestu domu par šīm interneta vēlēšanām, maskējoties caur interneta referendumiem. Paldies par uzmanību.
Thank you, Mr. Alberts. I understand this was a general comment rather than the question to someone in particular, but for the sake of timekeeping, well, we have proved that the time was too short, which we already knew when we started. But wrapping up, I think it's important to come together and discuss these challenges and issues openly without too much of the marketing and sales fog on it. I want to thank everyone who participated today, both speakers and participants. We will try as much as we can to answer any questions in the chat which we probably have missed, if only you have left your name, which is more than Santa Claus. And from my part, I would like to encourage you, to ask you to share, retweet memo from this conference, and exiting from this discussion, I personally do believe even more than before that it is a time to discuss this question at the national level in the format of multidisciplinary expert working group, to have a proper deliberation, because it will take more than 45 minutes, let's be honest, and to propose to produce an opinion statement that would be valid for decision makers in our country as it suits our country, because not only there are no secure systems in the world, there is no system that could be transposed one-to-one from one user to another, from one country to another country, especially in such very delicate processes, I would say, as elections. So as much as I would like to continue this discussion, I need to wrap up. Thank you again, everyone. And I do hope that we will have continuation for this discussion. I believe we have had also representatives from Ministry of Regional Development on the audience, but we've run out of all the additional time we were granted. So we must wrap up. Thank you. Safe and continue with this question, please.